on a quiet evening in a small town, something unthinkable happened. A pastor, known for his dedication to the community, became the center of a dark and tragic tale. His secret relationship, hidden from his family and congregation, took a deadly turn that no one could have predicted. The man he loved was found dead, and the once peaceful life of this respected pastor was shattered. What caused this loving relationship to turn into a nightmare? How did a trusted religious leader, admired by so many, become involved in such a terrible crime? As the investigation unfolds, we will see how secrets, fear, and passion came together to create a perfect storm of tragedy. This is not just a story about love, it's about betrayal, lies, and the devastating consequences of hidden truths. Stay with us as we uncover the full story behind this shocking crime. It all started in a small town where everyone seemed to know each other. Life moved slowly, and things were peaceful most of the time. People trusted their neighbors, and the church was the heart of the community. At the center of it all was Pastor Darnell Williams. He was a man everyone looked up to. He'd been the town's pastor for over a decade, delivering sermons every Sunday and helping people through their toughest times. Darnell had the image of a perfect family man. He was married to Rebecca, a well-respected woman, and they appeared to live a quiet, happy life together. But there was more to Darnell's life than anyone knew. Beneath the surface, a secret was growing, one that would eventually tear everything apart. He was living a double life, hiding a relationship with Jamal Turner, a younger man he'd met years earlier. Jamal, unlike Darnell, didn't have a reputation to protect. He was open about who he was, but Darnell's position as a pastor made it impossible for him to reveal the truth. Their relationship wasn't something that had started overnight. It began slowly, with private conversations and stolen moments. Darnell was careful to hide it from his congregation, his wife, and even his closest friends. For years he lived in constant fear of being found out, afraid of what might happen if his secret was revealed. Yet, the longer the relationship went on, the more trapped he felt. Jamal, on the other hand, had different expectations. He loved Darnell and wanted more time, more honesty, more of Darnell's attention. But Darnell wasn't willing to risk his life falling apart. This difference in needs created tension between them, tension that kept building with each passing month. Jamal didn't understand why Darnell couldn't be open about their relationship, and Darnell couldn't explain why his fears of losing everything were stronger than his love for Jamal. Things took a turn when Marcus Johnson, Jamal's best friend, started noticing the strain in Jamal's life. Marcus knew Jamal had been seeing someone, but he didn't know it was Darnell. Jamal kept the pastor's identity a secret out of respect and perhaps out of a sense of loyalty. But he couldn't hide his frustration from Marcus. Over drinks and casual conversations, Jamal began to open up about the difficulties he was facing, about how Darnell always put his church and reputation first, leaving Jamal feeling like he was second. As the months went by, Marcus pushed Jamal to confront the situation. Jamal was hesitant at first, unsure of what to do. He cared about Darnell but was tired of living in the shadows. He wanted to be with someone who wasn't afraid to love him openly. Yet, despite his frustration, Jamal didn't want to hurt Darnell. He knew how much the church meant to him and feared what might happen if the truth came out. Things started to unravel one evening when Darnell missed yet another planned meetup with Jamal. It wasn't unusual for Darnell to cancel or reschedule at the last minute, citing some church emergency or family commitment. But this time, Jamal had reached his breaking point. He felt ignored, abandoned, and angry. It wasn't just about Darnell not showing up, it was the years of being hidden, of never being able to be fully part of Darnell's life. That night, Jamal decided he couldn't continue living like this. He called Marcus, venting his frustration and telling him that something had to change. Jamal was torn between his love for Darnell and his need to move on. He knew confronting Darnell would be difficult, but he was tired of living a life that wasn't fully his own. Marcus, trying to support his friend, advised Jamal to talk to Darnell openly, to finally demand the honesty he deserved. Little did they know, that conversation would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Darnell, meanwhile, was dealing with his own struggles. He was constantly juggling his roles as a pastor, a husband, and a secret lover. The weight of it all was becoming too much for him to bear. He knew he was hurting Jamal by keeping their relationship a secret, but he couldn't see a way out. Every time he thought about telling the truth, fear gripped him. Fear of losing his church, his family, and the life he'd built over the years. In the days leading up to the confrontation, Darnell's anxiety grew. He could sense that something was about to change. His relationship with Jamal had been strained for months, and he knew Jamal wasn't happy. but he didn't know how to fix it without losing everything. He wanted to keep things as they were, to maintain the status quo, but deep down, he knew that wasn't possible anymore. The confrontation finally came one evening after Darnell had finished a church service. He was tired and stressed, not expecting the emotional conversation that awaited him. Jamal had come to his house, determined to talk, and there was no escaping it this time. They sat in Darnell's living room, the tension between them thick in the air. Jamal didn't waste time. He laid everything out on the table, his frustration, his anger, his need for more. He wanted Darnell to be honest with him, to finally make a decision about their relationship. Darnell, caught off guard, struggled to respond. He was torn between his love for Jamal and his fear of what might happen if the truth came out. As the argument heated up, Rebecca, Darnell's wife, walked in unexpectedly. She had been out for the evening but returned home earlier than planned. The sight of Jamal in her living room with her husband immediately raised her suspicions. Darnell tried to explain, but it was too late. Rebecca could sense that something wasn't right, and she wasn't going to let it go. At that moment, everything started to fall apart. Jamal, feeling cornered and emotional, blurted out the truth, everything about his relationship with Darnell, the years of secrecy, and the pain he had endured. Rebecca stood frozen, shocked by what she was hearing. The man she had trusted for years, the pastor everyone looked up to, had been living a lie. The confrontation didn't end there. In the heat of the moment, accusations flew, tempers flared, and the situation spiraled out of control. Jamal, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he had been carrying, stormed out of the house, leaving behind a shattered Darnell and a devastated Rebecca. That night would mark the beginning of the end for everyone involved. What started as a secret relationship had now turned into a ticking time bomb, and the fallout would be far worse than anyone could have imagined. The days after that confrontation were filled with tension that couldn't be ignored. Darnell, who had always been composed and in control, felt like his life was slipping through his fingers. Rebecca wasn't speaking to him, only giving him cold stares whenever they crossed paths in their home. The air in the house felt thick with silence, and Darnell was constantly on edge, knowing that the worst was yet to come. Jamal, on the other hand, was struggling with his own emotions. After storming out of Darnell's house that night, he felt a mix of relief and regret. He had finally revealed the truth, but now he feared the consequences. He had been in love with Darnell for years, but in that moment of anger he had blown everything wide open. Jamal knew that he had shaken Darnell's entire world, and that guilt weighed heavily on him. However, part of him was also tired of hiding, tired of being the secret. Meanwhile, Rebecca was grappling with her own sense of betrayal. She had stood by Darnell's side for years, trusting him to be the man of faith he always claimed to be. Now, everything she thought she knew was in question. The realization that her husband had been unfaithful was painful enough, but the fact that it was with a man, Jamal, was a shock she hadn't prepared for. She felt humiliated, confused, and angry, but most of all, she felt lost. Rebecca didn't know who to turn to or how to process what had happened. She couldn't confront Darnell yet, but she knew she had to do something. In the following week, Jamal tried to avoid contact with both Darnell and Rebecca. He was emotionally drained, unsure of what his next move should be. He spent a lot of time with Marcus, his closest friend, trying to make sense of the mess. Marcus, who still hadn't known about Darnell until now, was both shocked and concerned. He could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and he feared for his friend's safety, both emotionally and physically. One evening, while at Marcus' apartment, Jamal confided in him that he was worried. Darnell had been calling him nonstop, leaving voicemails and texts begging to talk. Darnell's messages were filled with panic, and Jamal could sense that something was about to happen. Marcus urged Jamal to stay away, telling him it wasn't worth getting involved any further, but Jamal couldn't let go so easily. He still cared about Darnell, despite everything, and part of him wanted to believe that they could fix things. Darnell, on the other hand, was unraveling. His mind raced with thoughts of what could happen if Rebecca told anyone. His reputation, his role as pastor, and everything he had built would be destroyed. He was a man torn between his public life and the private world he had created with Jamal. And now, both of those worlds were colliding in the worst way possible. Rebecca, meanwhile, had quietly started making plans. She had spent days in shock, replaying the events of that fateful night in her head. But now she was ready to act. She contacted a lawyer and began exploring the idea of a divorce. Rebecca wanted out of the marriage, but more than that, she wanted to make sure Darnell faced consequences for his betrayal. She hadn't yet decided how far she was willing to go, but the seeds of revenge had been planted. As the pressure mounted, Darnell became more desperate. One evening he decided to confront Jamal in person, showing up unannounced at his apartment. The conversation quickly escalated, with Darnell pleading for forgiveness and Jamal demanding answers. Darnell was frantic, pacing back and forth as he tried to convince Jamal that they could still make it work. But Jamal, fed up with the secrecy and lies, stood his ground. He wanted Darnell to leave his wife, to be honest about their relationship, but Darnell couldn't bring himself to do it. Their argument grew heated, with emotions spilling over on both sides. Jamal accused Darnell of using him, of never truly loving him, while Darnell tried to explain how trapped he felt. Neither man was willing to back down, and the tension in the room was palpable. It was clear that things were reaching a breaking point, but neither of them could see where it was heading. In the midst of their argument, Darnell's phone rang. It was Rebecca. He stepped outside to take the call, leaving Jamal standing in the apartment, frustrated and angry. The conversation between Darnell and Rebecca was brief but intense. She told him she was done, that she couldn't live with the lies anymore, and that she was filing for divorce. Darnell's heart sank. He tried to reason with her, but Rebecca had made up her mind. She hung up, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, his world crumbling around him. When Darnell returned to the apartment, his demeanor had changed. The panic and desperation were replaced by a cold determination. Jamal, sensing that something had shifted, tried to de-escalate the situation, but it was too late. Darnell, now backed into a corner, saw no way out. In a moment of blind rage, he lashed out at Jamal, accusing him of ruining his life. The argument became physical, with both men struggling in the confined space of the apartment. What happened next would be the turning point that no one could have predicted. Jamal, trying to defend himself, shoved Darnell away, causing him to stumble into a nearby table. Darnell, in a fit of rage, grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase, and struck Jamal across the head. Jamal collapsed to the floor, unconscious and bleeding. Darnell, breathing heavily, stood frozen for a moment, realizing what he had done. In that instant, everything changed. The man who had once been a respected pastor, the man who had tried so hard to hide his secrets, was now standing over the body of his lover, his hands shaking and his mind racing. He didn't know if Jamal was dead or alive, but the blood on the floor told him that things had gone too far. Panicking, Darnell grabbed his phone and called Marcus, telling him to come over immediately. Marcus, unaware of the full extent of what had happened, rushed to the apartment, his mind filled with worry for Jamal. When he arrived and saw the scene before him, he was horrified. Jamal was unconscious, and Darnell was pacing back and forth, muttering about how everything had gone wrong. Marcus, trying to stay calm, checked on Jamal, realizing that his friend was barely breathing. He demanded that Darnell call for an ambulance, but Darnell refused, too scared of what would happen if the police got involved. Marcus, torn between helping his friend and dealing with Darnell's panic, grabbed his phone and called 911 himself. When the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Jamal had succumbed to his injuries, leaving Marcus in shock and Darnell in complete disbelief. The once respected pastor had become a murderer, and there was no way to turn back time. The police arrived shortly after, with Officer Ryan Matthews leading the investigation. Ryan was a seasoned cop, known for his no-nonsense approach to cases like this. He took one look at the scene and knew that something wasn't right. The tension in the apartment was thick, and Darnell's behavior immediately raised red flags. As Darnell was taken into custody, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. He had lost everything: his church, his family, and now the man he had loved in secret. The life he had worked so hard to protect was gone, and all that was left were the shattered pieces of a broken man. The moment Officer Ryan Matthews stepped into the apartment, he sensed something wasn't right. It wasn't just the sight of Jamal's lifeless body on the floor or the pool of blood that confirmed a struggle had taken place. It was Darnell's demeanor, distraught but distant, as if he hadn't fully processed what had just occurred. Marcus, who had been the one to call 911, stood off to the side, visibly shaken but trying to maintain his composure. Officer Ryan was a seasoned investigator, used to walking into grim scenes like this, but something about the situation felt off from the very start. He had handled cases involving domestic disputes before, but a pastor being involved in such a crime, especially a pastor with such a respected reputation, was not something that happened every day. His gut told him there was more to the story, and he knew he would have to piece it together carefully. The paramedics confirmed that Jamal was dead. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head. As they moved Jamal's body to the ambulance, Officer Ryan began his questioning. He started with Marcus, who was still in shock from what had unfolded. Marcus explained that he had arrived just after the incident and had immediately called 911 when he saw Jamal on the floor. Officer Ryan pressed for more details. "What exactly happened before you got here?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward Darnell, who was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Finally, Marcus admitted that Jamal and Darnell had been arguing earlier in the evening. He knew the two had been involved in a relationship, something that had been kept secret for a long time. Marcus explained how things had escalated after Darnell's wife, Rebecca, discovered the truth about her husband and Jamal. With that revelation, Officer Ryan's suspicions grew. A secret relationship, years of lies, and now a death. This was no simple argument gone wrong. The tension between the pastor and his lover had clearly reached a breaking point, and it had ended in tragedy. But why had things turned so violent? Next, Officer Ryan turned to Darnell. He had dealt with men like Darnell before, people whose lives seemed to unravel in an instant, leaving them in a daze, unsure of how things had gotten so out of hand. Darnell's hands were still shaking, and his eyes were red from tears, but Officer Ryan wasn't going to let emotions cloud the facts. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Darnell mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "It just got out of control." Officer Ryan asked him to walk through the events of the evening. Darnell's story was shaky at best. He explained how Jamal had come over to talk about their relationship, how the argument had spiraled, and how in a moment of blind rage, he had struck Jamal with a vase. He kept repeating that he didn't intend to hurt Jamal, that it was an accident, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The force of the blow, the scene of the struggle, it all pointed to more than just a brief moment of anger. Darnell also mentioned his phone call with Rebecca just before the fatal altercation. That was another piece of the puzzle Officer Ryan knew he would need to explore. He made a mental note to speak with Rebecca, knowing that her side of the story could reveal critical details about the days leading up to Jamal's death. As the night dragged on, the apartment became quieter. The crime scene investigators gathered evidence, taking photos, collecting fingerprints, and bagging the vase that had been used as a weapon. Officer Ryan remained focused, determined to uncover the truth behind this tragedy. He knew that this case was far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. The next day, Officer Ryan visited Rebecca. She had filed for divorce after discovering her husband's affair, and now she was trying to process the news of Jamal's death. Rebecca's reaction to Officer Ryan's visit was a mixture of shock and bitterness. She was grieving not for Jamal, but for the life she thought she had with Darnell, a life that had been shattered by lies and betrayal. Rebecca revealed more about the night she had walked in on Darnell and Jamal, and how she had immediately confronted Darnell. She described the hurt and humiliation she had felt, realizing that the man she had shared her life with for years had been keeping such a massive secret from her. "It's like I didn't even know him," she said quietly, shaking her head. When Officer Ryan asked if she thought Darnell was capable of violence, Rebecca paused. "He's never been violent," she said slowly, "but I've seen him lose his temper before. Especially when he's cornered, when he feels like he's losing control." Those words stayed with Officer Ryan as he continued his investigation. It painted a picture of a man who had been under immense pressure for years, trying to balance a double life while keeping his secrets buried. But the more Officer Ryan dug, the clearer it became that Darnell's actions that night hadn't been as spontaneous as he claimed. As the investigation progressed, more details came to light. The forensic analysis of the crime scene confirmed that the struggle between Darnell and Jamal had been brief but intense. The blood spatter patterns indicated that Jamal had been hit while standing, and the force of the blow suggested that it had been delivered with anger, not by accident. In addition, Darnell's phone records showed that he had called Marcus after the incident, asking for help before calling 911. This raised more questions for Officer Ryan. Why had Darnell called his friend first? Was it because he was panicked and needed support, or was there something more to it? Officer Ryan also interviewed members of the church, many of whom were stunned by the news of Darnell's involvement in the crime. Some described him as a kind and compassionate pastor, while others hinted at the pressure he had been under, trying to maintain his image while dealing with personal demons. There were whispers about Darnell's erratic behavior in recent months, though no one had ever imagined it would lead to something like this. As the investigation deepened, Officer Ryan began piecing together the events leading up to Jamal's death. It was clear that Darnell had been living in fear of being exposed, and when Rebecca discovered his secret, everything had started to unravel. The confrontation with Jamal that night had been the final breaking point, a collision of guilt, anger, and desperation that had spiraled into violence. But the case wasn't closed yet. Officer Ryan still needed to uncover the full truth behind the murder. Was it really an accident, as Darnell claimed, or had the pressure of his double life pushed him to commit a deliberate act of violence? With each new piece of evidence, the answers became clearer, but the questions surrounding Darnell's motives remained. Darnell remained in custody, awaiting his day in court, while the community he had once served struggled to come to terms with the shocking crime. For Officer Ryan, the investigation had revealed not just a tragic death, but the darker side of a man who had spent years hiding from his own truth. As the investigation neared its conclusion, one thing was certain: the carefully constructed life Darnell had worked so hard to protect was now in ruins, and the full consequences of that night's events were yet to unfold. Months passed, and the town was buzzing with news of the upcoming trial. The shocking nature of the crime: Pastor Darnell Williams, a trusted and respected figure in the community, now facing charges for the murder of his lover, had gripped everyone's attention. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of supporters from Darnell's congregation and others who were there out of sheer curiosity, wanting to see how this unbelievable story would unfold. Darnell sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mix of exhaustion and resignation. He no longer looked like the composed man the town once knew. His eyes were dull, his posture slumped, and his hands, once steady as he delivered sermons, were now trembling. Across the courtroom sat Rebecca, her expression unreadable. She had filed for divorce soon after the incident, and was now preparing to face her estranged husband in court. Jamal's family, who had only learned about their son's secret relationship after his death, sat together in quiet grief. The loss of their son had left them devastated, and now they were here, hoping for justice. The prosecution opened their case with a clear narrative. Darnell, after living a double life for years, had finally reached his breaking point when his secret was exposed. Unable to handle the pressure of his hidden relationship and the impending collapse of his marriage, he had lashed out in a fit of rage, killing the man he had once claimed to love. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had spent years lying to everyone around him: his congregation, his wife, and his lover, and when it all became too much, he had resorted to violence. They brought in evidence from the crime scene, including the blood spatter analysis, the vase used as the murder weapon, and the phone records showing Darnell's frantic call to Marcus before contacting 911. The prosecution also read excerpts from Darnell's texts to Jamal in the weeks leading up to the incident, messages that hinted at the growing tension in their relationship and Darnell's increasing desperation to keep his life from falling apart. Next, they called Marcus to the stand. Marcus, still visibly shaken by everything that had happened, recounted the events of the night Jamal was killed. He described how he had arrived at Jamal's apartment, only to find his best friend lying on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. Marcus explained that Darnell had been pacing back and forth, mumbling incoherently about how things had gone wrong. He testified that Darnell had shown no real urgency to call for help, which raised questions about whether Darnell had truly intended to save Jamal's life, or if he had already accepted what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to present Darnell as a man who had simply lost control in a moment of intense emotional stress. They argued that Darnell had never intended to kill Jamal, that it had been a tragic accident brought on by years of internal struggle and emotional turmoil. They framed Darnell as a man torn between his faith, his duty to his family, and his love for Jamal, pressures that had finally caused him to snap in a moment of overwhelming anger. The defense also emphasized Darnell's years of service to the community. They called several members of his congregation to testify, all of whom described him as a caring and compassionate leader who had always been there for them in their time of need. They painted a picture of a man who had devoted his life to helping others and who had simply made a terrible mistake. When it was time for Rebecca to take the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Everyone was eager to hear what she had to say. She had been the catalyst for the unraveling of Darnell's life, the one who had discovered his secret and had confronted him on the night everything fell apart. Rebecca spoke calmly, though there was a hint of sadness in her voice. She described the night she had walked in on Darnell and Jamal, how she had immediately known that everything she thought she knew about her husband had been a lie. "I didn't know the man I was married to," she said quietly. "He had been living this double life for years, and I was completely blind to it. I trusted him. I believed in him. And then, in a single moment, everything came crashing down." Rebecca also described how she had seen a change in Darnell in the months leading up to Jamal's death. He had become more withdrawn, more anxious, and had started lashing out in small, uncharacteristic ways. "I think he was terrified of being exposed," she added. "He was trying to hold everything together, but it was like watching a dam that's about to break." The defense tried to push the narrative that Darnell had been overwhelmed by the emotional stress of his situation and had simply snapped, but Rebecca's testimony didn't support that theory. Instead, it suggested that Darnell had been building toward this breaking point for a long time, and when his secret life was finally exposed, he couldn't handle the consequences. Officer Ryan Matthews, the lead investigator on the case, also took the stand. He walked the jury through the details of the investigation, explaining how the evidence at the scene had pointed to a violent struggle between Darnell and Jamal. He described how Darnell's initial story that the blow to Jamal's head had been accidental didn't match the physical evidence. The force of the blow, the placement of the blood spatter, and the defensive wounds on Jamal's arms all suggested that this had been a deliberate act, not an unfortunate accident. Ryan also presented the phone records, highlighting Darnell's delay in calling for help after the incident. The prosecution argued that this delay showed a lack of concern for Jamal's well-being, further indicating that Darnell had acted out of anger rather than panic. When Darnell finally took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when Darnell would finally explain his actions in his own words. Darnell looked worn down, as if the weight of his guilt had been eating away at him for months. He spoke softly, his voice cracking at times. He admitted to his relationship with Jamal, explaining how it had started years ago and how he had tried to keep it hidden out of fear of losing everything: his family, his church, his reputation. Darnell said he had loved Jamal, but that love had been overshadowed by the constant fear of being discovered. On the night of Jamal's death, Darnell said he hadn't meant to hurt him. He claimed that the argument had spiraled out of control and that he had lashed out in a moment of frustration. "I was afraid," Darnell said. "I didn't know what to do. I thought I had lost everything, and in that moment, I lost control." The defense tried to portray Darnell as a broken man who had made a terrible mistake, but the prosecution countered by pointing out the deliberate nature of the attack. They argued that Darnell's actions were not those of a man who had simply snapped, but of someone who had been pushed to the edge and had made a choice, one that resulted in the death of an innocent man. The closing arguments from both sides were intense. The prosecution urged the jury to see Darnell for what he was: a man who had lived a lie for years and, when confronted with the truth, had reacted with violence. They argued that Darnell's actions were not the result of an emotional outburst, but a calculated attempt to protect himself from the consequences of his double life. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded with the jury to show compassion for a man who had been trapped by his own circumstances. They argued that Darnell had been under immense pressure and had made a terrible mistake in a moment of weakness. As the jury began their deliberations, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Everyone knew that the decision they were about to make would determine the fate of a man who had once been a pillar of the community, but who had now become a symbol of betrayal and violence. The jury deliberated for several hours, carefully weighing the evidence presented in the case. The courtroom was tense, filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Darnell sat quietly, his face expressionless, though the weight of the situation was evident in his slumped posture. His life now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, and he knew that whatever the verdict, his future would never be the same. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The decision was met with a mix of reactions. Jamal's family silently wept, Rebecca remained stoic, and Darnell lowered his head, the reality of the situation sinking in. The jury had rejected the defense's argument that the killing was an accident, instead concluding that Darnell had acted with intent, though not premeditation. The sentencing followed shortly after. Darnell was given 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. For a man who had once stood at the center of the community, respected and admired, this was the end of everything he had worked to build. His secret life, exposed in the worst possible way, had led to the death of someone he claimed to love, and now he would spend the better part of his life paying for that crime. Rebecca quietly finalized the divorce and left town soon after the trial, seeking to rebuild her life far from the shadow of her husband's betrayal. Jamal's family continued to mourn the loss of their son, left to grapple with the pain of his death and the circumstances surrounding it. Officer Ryan Matthews closed the case, satisfied that justice had been served, but knowing that there were no real winners in this tragic story. The town, once so tightly connected to Darnell, was left to process the shock of what had happened, and life would never return to what it once was. Darnell, now stripped of his title, his family, and his future, faced the cold reality of his actions. The double life he had tried so hard to protect had led him down a path of destruction, and now he had nothing left but the time to reflect on the choices he had made and the life he had destroyed in the process.